On into my office, Kris here. We're continuing our teaching on just thinking, about thinking righteously, thinking biblically. And today, flesh that thought. Say that, flesh that thought. I told you the other day that I met Bob Harrington, the chaplain of Bourbon Street, a few years ago. He showed us, pulled out of his pocket, a little porcelain toilet about that big. It had a flusher on it, made a flush sound. He said sometimes I'll be standing in a busy elevator, and all of a sudden I push that trigger, it makes the flush sound. People look at me, and I say, flush that thought. Well, because we live in the flesh, there's a lot of thoughts that we think that need to be flushed. Number one, have you ever said, a thought came into my mind? Well, if it did, where did it come from? You know, God introduces thoughts. There's always a source behind it. The devil introduces thoughts. The world system does. Advertisers do. Groupthink does. The flesh does. Thoughts come into your mind. It says that in Ezekiel 38 and verse 10 regarding Gog. It says, a thought shall come into your mind, and you shall think an evil thought. In other words, here comes the thought. He mulls over it. It becomes a consideration. Acts 8 and verse 22, Peter said to Simon Magus, pray that the thought of your heart may be forgiven you. Why is that? Because there are thoughts down on the inside. Second, have you ever said something and then wondered, where did that come from? I mean, you've got a normal thinking process, and then bam, here comes a sentence out of left field. You wonder how that happened. Well, it's because we still live in the flesh. We're trying to move into walking in the Spirit, but we're in the flesh. That's why in Ephesians 4:22, be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Romans 12 and 2, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The mind has to be changed. Mark 7 verse 21, Jesus said, from within, out of the heart, proceed evil thoughts. And in Genesis 6 and verse 5, before the flood, the imagination of the thoughts of their heart was only evil continually. They needed to learn to flesh that thought. And then number 3, we speak about a thinking process. Thinking process. It goes like this. The devil says to Eve, yea, hath God said. Well, that's a thought. But the thought became a consideration. The consideration then became an attitude. An attitude always shows itself in an action. And then an action repeated becomes a habit, and ultimately that habit becomes a stronghold. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then she does what? She not only thought it, now she passes the forbidden fruit to her husband, and we have the first virus introduced in the Bible right there. And number 4, we speak of a chain of thought. Well, thoughts cut grooves in our minds. Pretty soon it determines our behavior, thinking processes, memories are triggered, and then response mechanisms. It's a chain, and therefore it brings you into a chain. We talk in 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 4, it says that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but are mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. So that thought that became an attitude now becomes a stronghold, and the chain of thinking puts you in chains. And then number 5, you need to ask yourself, this is important, what was I thinking? You know, what was I thinking? What you were thinking brought you to where you are. So what you continue thinking will take you to where you are going. Let me say this, I've got to be serious with you. When somebody goes to hell, the first thing out of their mouth is, oh my God. You know, they should have said, oh my God, when they had a chance to talk to him. The second thing that comes out of a man's mouth is, what was I thinking? Listen, folks, eternity depends on the way you think. I'm talking this week on just thinking. And then number 6, let me close with this. There are 2 kinds of failures in this world, according to Frances Littauer. She talks about those who thought and never did, and those who did and never thought. You know, sometimes we think a lot and then we never put it to work. We never act on it. But other times we act when we should have been thinking. Flesh that thought. And people have advised you, they've advised me, you better think long and hard about this. Well, you're thinking about a divorce, you're thinking about pulling on a business partner, you're thinking about taking some big life action in your life, you'd better stop and think. And that's what I want to close with, just stop and think. Okay? Take your time and rationalize things through. Make sure it lines up with the Word and seek what the Holy Spirit has to say. And ask, what would Jesus do? Kris here, hope you've been enjoying this series. Share it with a friend, and we'll see you tomorrow with more on Just Thinking.